Albert, thank you for joining us. Albert said, now there's nothing left for me to say, but I think we have a lot more for him to say. Albert, there is so much for you to say that we'll start right off because we have a pretty short time to go.
I want to make sure that do you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, I think you're on, absolutely. Albert, World War II began, of course, in September 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. But for France, the war really didn't come till the following May of 1940 when Germany attacked France. You were nearly 2 years old at that time. Before we turn to the war years and what it meant for you and your family in the Holocaust, tell us first a little bit about your family and their life in the years before the war.
Well, excuse me, stop. My parents were born in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, the capital of Turkey, which was part at that time of the Ottoman Empire. And they grew up there, and they stayed there until 1923. The Ottoman Empire joined forces with Germany during the First World War, which meant that when Germany was defeated, there was a big conference in Versailles, outside of Paris, and the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, and then came a strong man in Turkey who tried to salvage whatever could be salvaged from the Ottoman Empire, which was already disintegrating before the war. So at that point, the Jews started to be scared. They had seen the genocide of the Armenians. They had seen the Greeks. There was a big Greek community in Izmir, which is a port city in Turkey. And they were not expelled per se, but they were encouraged to leave, in other words. So they went back to Turkey, to Greece, and so the Jews started to be scared about, concerned about their future. They saw the Armenians and they saw the Greeks. They say maybe we're next. So at that point, a lot of Jews decided to immigrate, and my parents had been schooled at the school of an international organization called l'Alliance Israélite Universelle, where education was provided in French. So my parents were perfectly fluent in French at that point. So when they decided to immigrate, they went to France. And actually they went separately. They didn't know each other. They met in Paris in 27 and they married in 28. And my sisters were born in 1930, 1933, and I was born in 1938 with my twin brother who passed away at the age of 6 months.
Albert, you described to me that your father was very smart but self-educated. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, my father had to start working at the age of 10, so he didn't go to school very long. My mother went to the end of her secondary school education. She got what they call at that time le brevet supérieur, which was the equivalent of the baccalaureate. So she was more educated than my father. But my father was very smart and very strong man, actually. So he managed to self-educate himself.
Mm-hmm. And what was, when they got to Paris and they met and they married, what was their economic situation like?
Bleak.
Bleak.
No, it was not good. My father had odd jobs. He didn't have a big education, so he couldn't get a good job. But he managed to learn accountancy, and he became an accountant, and he was hired by this garment factory in Montrouge, which is a suburb of Paris. That's where we moved at that point. The owner of the factory was a Jew, and he had allowed my family to live in the janitor's apartment of the factory. So we were living on the compound of the factory. I remember the big cobblestones there, and I have faint memories, but there are some images that stick with me actually. And it was a long yard like that. On one side you had the offices, on the other side you had the workshops where they were making garments actually. It was ready to wear, but they were luxury garments, and they would sell to the luxury stores, department stores in France, in Paris. And my father's boss allowed us to live in the garment and the janitor's apartment there, and we lived there until 1942. I will come back to that when we get to that point, but it was fine. It was a nice apartment and everything, but when France was invaded and when France was invaded, there was a battle. The French army was defeated. Most of the soldiers were taken prisoner. And
Albert, before you turn to that, let me ask you just one more question. With your parents having left Turkey and moved to France, what was their citizenship status?
They lost, as soon as they immigrated from Turkey, they lost their Turkish citizenship and they were stateless.
So they did not get French citizenship?
No, it took them
decades.
Much long.
Yeah.
It took them a quarter century to get French citizenship. But no, at that point they were stateless, but they managed when I was born, I don't know about my sisters, but when I was born, I know that my father made me French by naturalization at birth.
At birth. Mm-hmm.
So I still have the certificate, which is a parchment now, it's falling apart, saying that I was made French at birth. So I was French, but my parents were not. So when France was defeated, the government resigned and a new government was formed, which was a collaborationist government under the head of a hero of the First World War, Maréchal Pétain, who hired a prime minister by the name of Pierre Laval, who was a notorious anti-Semite and a collaborator. And so they started collaborating actively. When I say actively, they were doing all the dirty job for the Germans. The Germans would ask for X number of men or to go to work to Germany, and they would oblige, they would provide the men. Mm-hmm. And there was a big roundup, the biggest of all, on July 16 and 17, 1942, La Rafle du Veldiv, where the Germans had asked for 20,000 men only, and the French government provided 13,000, but not men only, men, women, children, elderly people, sick people, everybody was taken away, and they were parked in a stadium called Veldiv, which there was a track where they had bicycle races. One of the most famous races was called the 6 Days. For 6 days they were turning around like that on the track. And my parents, not my parents, the 13,000 Jews who were rounded up during that big roundup were parked there. It was in the middle of July. It was very hot. They had no water. They had the toilets were out of order very quickly because they were not equipped to withstand the presence of 13,000 people for several days. I don't know how long they stayed, maybe 1 week in that stadium. And eventually they were sent to transit camps south of France, and from there they were sent to Auschwitz, and there were 4,000 children out of them, and none of the children came back from Auschwitz.
Albert, that was July of 1942. Let's go back to May 1940 when Germany invaded France. And very quickly, they marched on Paris, and there was this mass exodus from Paris. And one of the things that you said to me, that for you and your family, quote, it all began with the exodus from Paris. Tell us about that.
Well, this exodus, everybody was running away from the Germans. So some people would go by car, some people on bicycles, some people on foot. As far as I know, I think we went by train. We went south to a city on the River Loire. The River Loire is famous for its beautiful chateau, actually. And we went to Orléans, and we stayed in a chateau, actually, there, a small chateau. It was nothing fancy or anything like that. We were sleeping. There had been requisitioned to house the people who were running away. But we couldn't go very far because there was a demarcation line. It was only the northern part of France that was occupied. It was the northern part, and the south was called the so-called free zone, which was only relatively safe, actually. A lot of people were deported. It was occupied starting November 11, 1942. They took the anniversary of the end of the First World War to occupy the rest of France. Okay. So when we were in that chateau, I was just 2 years old, and my mother didn't have anything to feed me, and I was crying, which, a 2-year-old, if you don't feed him, the only way to express himself is to cry. And I was disturbing the peace. We had a lot of people in that chateau. We were sleeping on the floor, but I was disturbing the peace. And at one point, one of the soldiers who had managed to escape after the Battle of France was there, and he had a flask of schnapps, and he gave a shot of schnapps to my mother. He said, "Give that to him, that will calm him down," and apparently it did.
Albert, back to the Exodus for a minute before you got to Loire. For our audience, I mean, the estimates are as high as 80% of the population of Paris fled Paris by foot, in carts. It was a massive humanity.
Yes, a massive, and it was a total chaos. And we were under the fire of the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force, and the Italian Air Force also. It was called the stab in the back. And at that point, my grandmother, who had gone to get some food for us, was killed by strafing. And my mother lost also a brother, a sister, and 2 nephews who were fleeing by car when a bomb fell on their car on a bridge in Orléans. So that was these were the first tragedies that struck us during the war.
So quickly, your mother's mother and her brother
and sister,
all
and
killed.
2 nephews.
All killed. Was your father with you when you fled Paris?
No, my father stayed behind. I guess he wanted to keep on working. I don't know why he didn't join us. He stayed behind, and after a few days, I don't know whether it was 1 week or I have no idea how long it was just a few days. My mother decided that we should go back home, and that's what we did.
So you go back to Paris from Loire, and you would stay there for the next 2 years until the July of 1942. Yeah. Tell us about that period of time. Those 2 years while you were living there.
I don't have much to tell you about that because my recollection starts precisely in July 1942. In July 1942, when France was invaded, there was a collaborationist government that was formed, I told you, and this government enacted a statute of the Jews which was modeled on the Nuremberg laws that were depriving the Jews in Germany from most of their basic rights. And we were submitted to the same rules starting in July 1942. That's when they had the big roundup at the Veldiv.
You described.
But the roundups had started in 1941, and they continued until July 1944, 1 month before the liberation of Paris, actually. So we were under constant danger of being rounded up and sent to a death camps. Because if they had taken us, my father was a strong man. He could have survived in these camps, but my mother, my sisters, and me, we would have been sent directly to the gas chamber. Mm-hmm. So my parents were very concerned about that. And in 1942, in the fall of 1942, they decided to send us to a farm.
And was that after they had moved to another apartment?
Yeah, I forgot to mention. Yes, we were expelled from the apartment. You know, the factory that belonged to a Jew was expropriated, and the owner had to flee and to go into hiding, and we were expelled from the apartment, and we had to find an apartment in no time. Mm-hmm. It was a very small apartment, 2-room, not 2 bedrooms, 2-room apartment, a small kitchen and a toilet, and that was it. No bathroom, nothing like that. So we were in that apartment, and they started rounding up people, and my parents were very concerned, and at one point they decided to send us to a farm. We went to a farm in a place called Thoiry, which is outside of Paris, which is famous now. They have safari parks there. But in those days it was just farmland. So, and we spent the fall and winter of 1942-43 on that farm.
Were you all together on that farm?
With my sisters.
With your sisters?
My parents stayed behind. My father kept on working, and my mother stayed home, I guess. And
probably still in that small apartment that you.
In the small apartment, yeah. Yes, in the small apartment.
Do you know anything about your time with your sisters at that farm? What that was like for you?
Yes. I remember. Actually, you know, my parents had not told the ladies that we were Jewish. They said that they could not feed us properly in Paris because everything was rationed. You know, everything was with ration tickets. So to buy a loaf of bread, you have to give so many tickets and everything. An egg was a luxury item. Now we buy the eggs by dozens, not 1 dozen, but dozens. In those days, 1 egg was a luxury item. So we didn't have eggs. We had a very small portion of butter and bread, and stale bread, which was made of flour, brown, and sometimes they put some sawdust in to make it more consistent. So, yeah.
So your parents had told the family that you were there because they couldn't feed you, but yes. You had to leave. Tell us about that.
But yeah, my parents had not said. It was 2 ladies who were tending the farm. Madame Artus, I still remember the name of the lady. Mm-hmm. And it was 2 sisters, I think. And they had a big dog, and they were raising pigs and rabbits. And I was awakened in the morning because the pigtail was right below my bedroom, and they made a lot of noise early in the morning, and I would hear them, and that would wake me up. And during the day, I was spending hours watching the rabbits. So for me it was fine. The winter was very cold. There was a lot of snow. My sisters would go to school, to the public school there. You know, it was school for boys and girls. In those days it was unusual because boys and girls would be sent to separate schools. But in the countryside they had 1 school with maybe 1 class, and each row was a different grade. Mm-hmm. So anyway, my sisters would go to that school, and I would stay with the ladies. And I was talking to them, and 4 years old, what did I know? One day in the conversation, I told them that we were Jewish. And they sent us right back to our parents. They didn't want to take any chances with the Jews, so they sent us back to our parents. At that point, my father took me apart and said, "Don't ever say that you're Jewish." So, on a 4-year-old, what do you think? you start wondering, is there anything wrong about being Jewish? You know, it was like a stigma. And so I was afraid, I was ashamed, I don't know. And I kept it a secret for quite a few years, even after the war. I remember when I was 11, it was after the war, 49, I had an appendectomy. And I went to a hospital, and the nurses were nuns. And the nun who was taking care of me asked me, "Are you going to catechism? Are you preparing for your first communion?" And I said, yes. I was still afraid of saying that I was Jewish. And I heard some anti-Semitic slur in the playground in the school about other kids using anti-Semitic slurs. And I would not react because I was afraid or I was ashamed. I don't know. It was a combination. It was very complex. But anyway. So it took me quite a few years after the war, maybe when I turned around 15 or 16, that I started to open up. And since then, I never closed.
You never closed. Albert, in September 1943, your father was taken for forced labor.
Yes.
And then soon after that, your mother, your sisters, and you went into hiding. Tell us what you can about your father being sent to forced labor, and then about how your mother found a hiding place for her and her children.
It was almost a miracle. But anyway, my father was summoned to go to a slave labor camp on the Channel Islands. The Channel Islands are small islands between France and Great Britain, and that was the only British territory under German occupation. And they were building blockhouses, bunkers, and fortifications to stop any invasion from the Allies. That was called the Atlantic Wall. And my father, during that captivity, he had a big accident. He was carrying cement on his head, on a trough on his head, and he stepped on the loose board, and the board came to hit him on the head, and he fell off a cliff. And he was picked up maybe a couple of hours later. He was losing his blood, and he was picked up by the soup truck. And eventually they sewed him the best they could. And it's too bad I have a picture of my father. My father was bald, and you can see the scars on his head. It makes like a big question mark. It's like this. And he suffered. I remember he had some migraines after the war, and he died of seizures much later. So it didn't affect him really. That didn't stop him from having as normal a life as possible, but he died of seizures. So I guess it was connected to his accident.
You shared with me, Albert, that one of your early memories is seeing your father leave when he was taken for forced labor.
Yes, I still have that memory. It was in September 43, so I was 5 years old. And usually, he had to take the metro. And he would go with his gas mask. It was in a cylindrical box like that. He was wearing it around his neck like that. And usually we would to go to the metro, we had to take a bus. It was about 1.5 miles away from our home. But that time we walked to spend a little more time with our father. And we saw him getting on the metro. And of course, my mother was very desperate at that time. She had to, she knew that at any moment they could come and take us away. And one day, she met this lady in the street market. She didn't even know her. She had never met her before, Madame Gallos. And somehow she felt that she could open up to her, and she told her that she was terrified that at any moment they could come and take us away. So Madame Gallos went home, told her husband, and the next day her husband came to us with a cart, and we took whatever we could, and we went to live with a Gallos family. It was in the same suburb of Paris, Montrouge, and we went to live with them. The Gallos family, the Gallos had 2 daughters. I was 5 at that time. They had 2 daughters, 4 and 3. So to me, it was the happiest time I had during the war, because the Gallos were absolutely charming people. Monsieur Gallos, and they have a very strong southern accent from France, which is very warm, and he would tell us stories that were supposed to scare us, and we were laughing. So, and he made some toys, so he was very handy. He was a sculptor, and he was making sets for the movie studios, and they had a big warehouse behind the house where they were storing all these sets. And, with Janine and Mireille, the little girls, we would have great hide-and-seek games in that warehouse. To me, these people were wonderful. They didn't make us feel that we were at war, and that we were facing a great danger of being taken away. I was 5 years old. What did I know about the danger?
The risk for them was huge.
It was the risk for them. If they had been, if someone had denounced them, reported them as hiding Jews, we would have been taken away, but I'm not sure that they would not have followed us. I'm not sure, because I think it was people were executed for hiring Jews, actually. So it was these people. I try to comprehend how can a family with 2 young daughters take the risk for their lives and the lives of their daughters to save a family of people they didn't even know 2 days before. Mm-hmm. To me, that's it's amazing. It's a really. I've wondered whether, in my life, if I had been in the same situation, if I had had the same courage that they had. And they were never making us feel that we pose a danger for them or anything like that. They made us feel as comfortable as they could with them. And for Christmas, he made some toys for us. I remember he made some piggy banks that were shaped like a safe, even out of wood. He painted them in green. I still see these piggy banks. And in those days in France, we had coins that were absolutely worthless. It was centimes of old francs. In 60, we removed 2 zeros to franc, and a new franc was 100 old francs. These were the old francs, and they gave us some centimes of these old francs. So they were literally worthless, but they were typical. They had a hole in the middle. And I remember these coins, that's what we would put in the piggy banks.
In the piggy bank.
Yes.
You shared that for you as a kid, as you said, you played hide and seek. It was kind of a great time, but it was very different for your mother and your sisters.
My mother was in constant terror. Yeah. In constant. I remember when somebody would knock at the door, we would go to the back room, and my mother would hush me, say, "Shh, don't say a word." Mm-hmm. And at that point, I had learned my lesson. I was keeping quiet.
In the spring of 1944, your mother had to take her children, you and your sisters, out of the home of the Gallos. Tell us why you had to leave the Gallos, and where did you go from there?
Well, the Gallos family lived in a small house, in a small street. There were about 10 houses altogether. It was mostly artists, painters, sculptors. And I remember it was a painter, his wife, Madame Perron, I still remember the name, who apparently was raving about my way of speaking. Apparently I was 5 years old, but I had very good diction. And she said that one day I will be a speaker. But anyway,
And here you are.
Here I am. Much later. Anyway, but she was a great admirer of the collaborationist governments and the editorialists who would speak on the radio, and she was raving about them. And one day, she went to see Madame Gallos and said, "When are you going to get rid of that scum?" We were the scum. So she liked me, but she didn't like the fact that we were Jewish. And so at that point, my mother and Madame Gallos thought it might be safer for us to go back home, because we couldn't afford to expose the Gallos to the danger of being denounced by this lady. So we went back home. And a few weeks later, around 7 o'clock in the morning, we were in bed. There was a knock on the door. 2 French police inspectors. Madame Garih, yes, we came to take you away. That's what my mother had been dreading all along. Actually, she was, she was having nightmares about that. She started shaking, and for whatever reason, I think it must have been more or less just about the time of DDay, and whether these police inspectors belonged to a resistance network, or maybe they had a conscience, and they told my mother, "We're going to report we didn't find you, but you must not sleep in your bed tonight. You have to find a place to hide." It's easier said than done. So I don't know, my mother had the name of a social worker. I don't know who gave her the name. And I still remember the name of this lady too. It was Mademoiselle Desgebert. I was 5 years old, but I still remember these things. And so my mother dressed us very quickly, because it was 7 o'clock in the morning, we were still in bed. And we went to see Mademoiselle Desgebert, the social worker. And my mother explained that we had to go into hiding again. And this social worker told my mother, "You have to give me a few days. I cannot find a place like that overnight. In the meantime, try to see if you cannot stay at some of your neighbors." And at that point, I must say, that was, to me, it was also a cultural shock. All the neighbors were ready to house us for the time, until this lady would find a hiding place for each one of us. So my mother and I, we would sleep at our next door neighbors, who were a communist couple, Monsieur and Madame Ménétrier, who had a daughter who was about my age, 2 or 3 months younger than me. And my sisters at the lodge keeper, Madame Papillon, who was, she was a mother of 3, she had 2 boys, 14 and 12, and a little girl 5 years old. And I never saw her husband. I think he must have been part of the soldiers who were taken prisoner during the Battle of France in 1940. So I never saw a man in that apartment, but she was the lodge keeper, and my sisters would sleep at the lodge keeper's apartment, and we would sleep at our communist neighbor's apartment. It was very convenient with the Ménétrier family, because they were working on night shifts. She was working in a print shop, and I think he was working with her. He had been summoned to go to mandatory labor service in Germany, and had not reported for duty. So he was also wanted by the Gestapo. Mm-hmm. So we were facing danger by staying with them, because if the Gestapo had come to take him away, they would have found us there. They would have taken us at the same time. So we spent a few days, I couldn't say whether it was 2 or 3 days or 1 week, I don't know, until eventually the social worker came to my mother and said, "Okay, I found a place for each one of you."
For each one of you, this time separately.
Yes, we were separate, yes. Yeah. My mother was placed as a governess with a family near the Eiffel Tower, right in front of the Eiffel Tower, actually. She was taking care of 8 or 10 children. And we were sent to a Catholic boarding school in a suburb east of Paris. The suburb is Montfermeil, which was made famous by those of you who may have read Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. That's where Jean Valjean met Cosette when she was getting some water.
He loves to read and he's a movie buff, so that you see that.
No, but that's a beautiful story anyway, because she was used as a slave by the Thénardier, and she was getting water at night. It was scary for a little girl, and that's where Jean Valjean met Cosette. Anyway, so we were in these schools, Catholic boarding schools. I was in a school for boys, and my sisters in a school for girls. And we would meet once a week, every Sunday, in church. We would go to Mass, at Catholic boarding school. We had to go to Mass every Sunday. And that's when I would see my sisters. The rest of the time I was 6 years old. I was the youngest in that school. The ages were from 7 until 14. I was the youngest. And I remember the headmistress. I'm sorry that I was a kid, so I don't remember her name. I wanted to have her recognized as righteous among the nation, because I think she was the one who took me into that school. And I was her protege. She was always looking after me. She was always holding my hand. 6 years old, cut out from your parents. It was not fun. And plus, the food was terrible. The food, no. When I say terrible, believe me, it was not funny. It was rotten beans. It was disgusting. But one day at a feast, the priest was suffering from some sort of cancer or ulcer or whatever, and they managed to get a couple of potatoes and a small piece of butter, and they made him mashed potatoes, and even that, he could not swallow them. Who was fed the mashed potatoes? I was the youngest. They gave it to me, I love mashed potatoes to this day. I still love mashed potatoes.
Albert, I was going to ask you, during this time, after your father had been sent away to slave labor, was your mother able to at all stay in contact with him for any part of that time? Did she know anything about his whereabouts?
Yes, actually, they were in this Channel Island. If he had been sent to the east, to Poland and all that, he would probably have finished in a gas chamber. But that was in these small islands. It was a Nazi organization called Organisation Todt. I don't know what it meant, but they were not treated very nicely either, but they could exchange some mail. And to this day, I remember, I don't remember the letters because my mother would not read them to me because I was too young, and if he was giving some details, she would keep them for her. But I remember the postmark on the envelopes. You had the eagle and the swastika. And I was fascinated by these envelopes. Unfortunately, they threw all that away once the war was over. And I'm sorry, because I would have loved to give that to the museum.
Right.
Anyway, yeah.
Albert, DDay, of course, took place June 1944. Paris was liberated in August of 1944. You were 6. What do you recall or know about your liberation and the reunification with your mother and your sisters? No idea. I never heard about D-Day, about the landing on the beaches in Normandy. And to me, I was 6 years old, and we didn't have a radio. We were not allowed to have a radio. And even those who had a radio, the only thing they could listen to was propaganda radio. Mm-hmm. Those who were caught trying to catch BBC. London. Yeah. Here, London. I remember it started with the 5 notes of the 5th Symphony, Beethoven 5th. Tum, 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 tum.
tum, 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 like that, and then they say, ici, Londres, les Français parlent au français. And then they had messages. Here, London, the French speaking to the French. And they gave some messages. And that's how the message was sent about DDay. They took 2 verses of a poem by Paul Verlaine, who was a 19th century poet. They gave the first verse, and they say, when you hear the second verse, that's the invasion is for tonight. And so, but I was 6 years old. We didn't have any radio. I was in that boarding school. I didn't know anything about the invasion. I remember one thing, actually, because my father had been moved. At one point, you know, the Allies were making everything to make the Germans believe that if there was going to be an invasion, it would take place in the Straits of Dover, which was the shortest distance between England and France. So they were bombarding there all the time. So at one point, the Germans moved the 900, there were about 900 inmates from the Channel Islands to the Straits of Dover. And my father told me a story about that. You know, they were under the fire of the Allies, the RAF and the US Air Force. And when they had bombardments like that, they didn't go to a shelter. When there were bombardments when I was in the school, we would go to the shelter. But my father, they had to lay flat on the ground and hoping to be spared. Right. And one time on one of these raids, my father was laying down on the ground next to a German soldier. And when the raid was over, my father could stand up, and the German soldier had been killed. Mm-hmm. So it was really touch and go all the time. Mm-hmm. So when the Allies landed in Normandy, well, anyway, let's go back to
how you found out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one day it was in the summer of '44. The summer was very hot. We were underfed, and we had practically no classes because it was the summer vacation. So we spent most of the time on the playground there. And I was very weak, that I remember. And I spare you the details because sometimes I didn't have the time to reach the toilets anyway. So it was really bad. And one day, one of the boys had run away from the school, and he came back saying, the Allies are coming, the Allies are coming. So we all went with the school on the main road, and we saw the tanks, the jeeps, the trucks, soldiers with different helmets. And it was the first time I ever heard of Americans. I'd never heard of Americans before. To me, it was a discovery. I was far from thinking that one day I would be one of them, but that's another. Anyway, so yes, I saw these Americans who were giving us chewing gum that we called Sem gum. That's how we would say it in French. Chocolate, and even cigarettes. So they were very generous, and smiling faces, friendly faces. Mm-hmm. And from that day on, we knew that the danger was over. We were no longer in danger of being taken away and deported and sent to the gas chambers. Because, as I said, the convoys of people to Auschwitz lasted until July 1944, and Paris was liberated in August 1944.
Right.
So,
tell us about reunification with your parents.
Yes, so after we had this memorable day of this liberation, as soon as they restored the train service, my mother was on the first train to come to see us because she had no way to communicate with us during that summer of '44. We were completely cut out, you know. It was too dangerous to send letters. And so as soon as the train service was restored, my mother was on the first train. And one morning, I see my sisters coming to my school, to the playground, and say, "Guess who's here?" You know what? At 6 years old, I had no idea. You know how fast we can forget about our loved ones. Actually, I had no idea who could come to visit us. You know, and so I pushed my sisters. My mother was short, so she was hiding with behind my sisters. I pushed them around, and when I saw my mother, of course, I jumped into her arms. But when she saw me, I was so skinny that she was appalled, and she took me home the same day. She had these ration tickets. She bought a loaf of bread. We swallowed the loaf of bread in no time. And we were, it makes me smile when I hear people say, "I'm hungry." They don't know what it means, actually. They don't know what it is. I experience hunger, really, and it's not fun. So anyway, she took me home right away, and she went back the next day to pick up my sisters for whatever reason. I don't know, she could not pick up my sisters the same day, so she had to go back, and she left me under the supervision of our next-door neighbor, Madame Ménétrier, and there was nothing to eat in the house except for a green apple. And I had an upset stomach. That was the worst thing I could have eaten, but I did eat it. And as soon as I finished the apple, I heard the key in the door. It was Madame Ménétrier who was coming to check up on me. And she said, "Did you eat something?" I said, "No." And of course I had, and it was not good. But I was so skinny that after the war, I was fed cod liver oil. Have you ever heard of a child who loves cod liver oil? You try to feed that to a child, he will reject it, and they would start crying. I was drinking it, my body needed that. And I was even given UV rays. I remember they put me on like in this
tanning place.
Tanning parlors and everything, and put me on a bed with a UV ray lamp, because I was really malnourished, actually. So I needed that. So anyway, we were reunited. My mother came back the next day with my sisters, and that was late August, or probably early September. And meanwhile, my father, who had been sent to the Straits of Dover, from there, when the Allies were pushing the Germans back towards Germany, east, one day the Germans put the 900 inmates on a train bound for Germany. We don't know what they had in store for them. Maybe they would send them to Auschwitz. Maybe they would use them in a slave labor factory. We don't know. But anyway, the train was stopped by Belgian resistance fighters in northern Belgium. Not Belgium, northern Belgium. And so there was a battle, and the resistance fighters liberated the 900 inmates, or they were released by the Germans. I don't know which one it was. Anyway, my father stayed a few days with the family there. Apparently, according to my sister, she gave me a detail that I didn't know. He was lucky to be housed by the baker. So he was fed, he had some bread. And although the bread was not good, but he was fed. And after a few days regaining some strength, he said to walk all the way from northern Belgium to Paris. That was a 200-mile trek, like going from New York to Washington on foot.
Did you have any inkling that he was coming home?
We knew, my father was detained in that camp with a first cousin of his, who had come a few days earlier. I don't know how he managed to come earlier, but he said, that Our dad was on his way home.
First, that he was alive.
That he was alive. No, we knew that he was
You knew he
alive
was alive,
because,
that point.
yes,
Okay.
but he was on his way home. So we knew that he was coming. But so we, in the meantime, life was resuming as normal as possible. The war, for us, the war was over at the end of August 1944. It ended up, the end of the war was May 8, 1945. But for us, we were out of the woods in late August, early September. So on October 1st was going back to school day. And it was my first day at school, and I was so motivated, so excited about going to school. And I remember that day like it was yesterday. And in the meantime, so my father walked from northern Belgium, and he arrived in the end of September. He arrived, I think it was 22nd or 23rd of September, which was Rosh Hashanah. And my mother was dressing us to go to synagogue for the first time, So there was a knock on the door, but this time it was a good one. It was my father who was coming back.
Do you remember
He was
that?
in bad shape. No, I don't remember how he looked. I know from my mother and my sisters. They told me that he looked appalling. Actually, he was gaunt and he had boils and he had all sorts of diseases. But he survived. He made it. So he could go back to work. I could go back to school. My sisters could go back to school. And my mother started working right after the war because we needed two jobs to provide for the family. So that's how we ended up. We lost, as I said, my grandmother, an uncle, an aunt, and some cousins, first cousins. Plus my mother lost some cousins also who were deported, who were sent to the camps, who never came back. So we lost some people. Mm-hmm. But our nuclear family was safe. My father, my mother, my sisters, and me, we all survived.
We're towards the end of our time, and we're going to, Albert's going to close our program in a moment, but I do want to ask him one more question. And you've had the opportunity to reconnect with the Gallos.
Oh, yeah.
Will you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, after the war, we would still see the Gallos, and we would go to visit them, and they would. I remember spending a couple of Christmas with them because they were Christians. We were not Christians, so we were not celebrating Christmas, but we were invited to their Christmas parties, and I remember that. But then we lost track, somehow. I don't know. I feel uncomfortable about that because I think we should have kept, these people saved our lives, and we should have kept in good contact with them, and we lost contact. The the parents, they retired in the south of France. They were from the south of France, so they went back to the south of France. And in 1992, I was in Paris at that time. I wanted to find out if I could find them. And there was a small computer called Minitel, which is a sort of electronic phone book, where I typed Aimé Gallos, and I found one. I called her. She was in Montpellier. I said, "Are you Madame Gallos, Aimé Gallos, the widow?" Because I knew that her husband had passed away. He had throat cancer. And she said, "Yes." I said, "Well, I'm Albert Garih." And she was so excited when I said, "Madame Gallos, I live in the States. I won't be able to come to see you now because I'm going home in the next couple of days." Excuse me. But I promise the next time I'm in France, I will come to visit you. And Then I was back in France a few months later. I took a flight from Paris to Montpellier in the south of France, and we were reunited. And it was a wonderful moment, actually. She was so happy, and I was so happy too. And I told her that I had started the process of having the Gallos family, as well as the Ménétrier, or next-door neighbors, recognized as righteous among the nations. She said, you have to hurry because I'm not going to last much longer. And actually, she passed away before the ceremony. The ceremony took place in November, in the spring of '92. She had passed away a few weeks before.
And that's formal recognition by the State of Israel for what they did. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think it may have been a consul of Israel in the south of France. And there was a ceremony, and they gave them a medal of the righteous. And their daughters were there with their husbands and with their children. Everybody was there except for the parents. But so it was a very moving experience, a very moving ceremony. They asked me to say a few words, and I was not very eloquent that day. Anyhow, I could have said a lot more. After I finished, I said I didn't say this, I didn't say that, I didn't say that. I could have spoken like I speak now, and I didn't have that chance. So anyway, and I saw the daughters, at least the eldest daughter, Janine, who was a headmistress in a Protestant school. Did I mention that they were Protestant? So I was saved by a Protestant family, a communist family, the Ménétrier, and a Catholic boarding school. So I had
covered the spectrum.
That gave me a very positive outlook on life, actually. So
I'm going to come back to Albert in just a moment, so please stay with us. I want to thank you for being with us, being in our program today. We'll have programs each Wednesday and Thursday until August 8th. The only exception is next week, because of July 4th, we'll have programs on the 2nd and the 3rd, which is Tuesday and Wednesday. All of our programs will be available on the museum's YouTube channel, so if you can't come back for another program, you can certainly view any of the programs that you would like to view. So thank you for being with us. When Albert is finished, because we did not have a chance for you to ask Albert questions, we invite anybody in the audience, all of you, to come up on stage afterwards if you would like to meet Albert, to ask him a question if you have one, have a photo taken with him, just say hi, whatever you'd like to do. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word. So with that, I'd like to turn to Albert to close today's program.
Okay, I was telling you that last October, I had some friends. When I was a student, I used to work as a tour guide in Paris. I was giving guided tours of Paris, the Château de la Loire, where we spent some time during the occupation, and the beaches in Normandy where the landing, where the invasion took place. And last October, we had some friends who they had said to me, I would love to visit Paris with you because I know that would be a different experience. I said, I'm going to Paris in October. If you want to join us, you're welcome. And they came with us, and we went to Paris. I gave them a guided tour of Paris. We went to some Château de la Loire, this beautiful chateau. And then we went to the Normandy beaches. And we had them this past weekend at home, and she's still raving about the trip that we took together because it had a different dimension being there with someone who lived through that period. So that was a moving experience. And I took some pictures, actually, which I added to my PowerPoint. About the beaches in Normandy, the cemetery with the crosses and some stars of David also, and the beaches and It's a very famous rock that took so many lives to conquer, you know, the Point du Hoc on Utah Beach, or between Utah and Omaha Beach, actually. And so it was an experience, and I strongly recommend a trip to this area. If you ever go to France, take the time to spend 2 days in Normandy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Albert. Thank you very much.